So before we get going and have our official start to the call, just wanted to run through a few slides to get us going today. For those of you who are relatively new to WebEx, here's a wonderful screen cap that sort of outlines how this works. In terms of the WebEx tools, we sometimes use a pointer. You have the ability as an attendee to raise your hand on the mid part of the screen on the right-hand side. So if you have any questions later on today, we encourage you to raise your hand, and we will unmute your line. We can also invite you to pop your questions in the chat box. If you look at the bottom right-hand side, you can send notes to everyone. So we're inviting you to introduce yourself by sending a note to everyone in the all participants box. And you can say hello to everyone, and you can also pop questions in there during Charlotte's presentation today. So just a quick overview of that. The other thing is, just so you know, we do encourage you to sign in with your phone as opposed to your computer. You'll find that the sound quality is a little bit better for today's session when you can do that. And if you're not sure if you've done that or not, usually you'll have a little phone sitting beside your name, as in the picture below here, as opposed to a little computer box. You're certainly more than welcome to sign in with a computer. We just found that the sound quality is a little bit sharper when you do dial in on the phone. The last thing is that we have muted all the lines as people come in. So right now everyone is muted. At some point in time we may unmute the lines, and just you have the ability to control your muting. So if you've got some background noise, you can just click this button on the right-hand side to mute your line. The other thing is, in terms of audio, if there's no phone beside your name, here's the instructions on what you can do. You can stay on the WebEx and hang up your computer connection and just connect via your telephone. So it works a little bit better in terms of sound quality, as I mentioned. We've already briefly talked about the chat, but we just wanted to remind you to please take a couple minutes to introduce yourself in the chat panel and let us know where you're from. We have 68 callers on the call today already, so welcome everyone. We're so thrilled that you could join us, and it's amazing to see where everyone's coming in from around the province. So we've got Prince George, we've got Port Hardy, we've got Vancouver, we've got all over the province right now, so please join us to introduce yourself. Last but not least, we are recording today's session. So in the recording for today's session, we will record the session, and we will be distributing both the recording and the slides for today's session to all of you after today's session. So those will be coming out, and Sue, if you don't mind just popping that link in the chat box, that would be brilliant. We are on Twitter. For those of you who are on Twitter today, we will be tweeting away. We invite you to use the hashtags cultural humility, and it starts with me. And we also are using the Twitter handles at FNHA and BCPSQC if you like to kind of use that. Now, the subject matter today can be sensitive, and due to the subject nature, the sensitive nature of this subject, people may become triggered. So we really want to encourage you to have a support system around you for the call. This might mean an elder, a trusted friend, or mentor, but just want to make sure you've got supports around you. If you do need support, please don't hesitate to call the 1-800 number that we've included on the screen here, and that's 1-800-588-8717. And just want to make sure you do have supports in place for you today. Certainly, let's get going with the official nature of our call, and it's always a pleasure that we have Virginia joining us for the Cultural Safety and Humility webinar series. She's been able to be with us on this journey from almost the start of this, the webinar series, starting our calls and ending our calls, and we really appreciate that. Virginia is a junior elder, I always like that expression, born to William and Nancy Phillips from Chehalis, BC. Her immediate family consists of 3 daughters, 2 sons, 11 grandchildren, 6 foster grandchildren, 11 great-grandchildren, and she has a very large extended family, definitely over 1,500 people. And I'm kind of envious of that. Her family is very close-knit and strongly linked. So Jenny has been with us through this journey, and she's had a long history of volunteering through the system in various community organizations. And we're really thrilled to have Jenny join us today for our opening prayer, and she'll also close us off at the end of today's session. So I'll hand it over to you now, Jenny. Welcome, and thank you.
ACM. Siama Toskui. I'm from Chehalis, and my original name is Virginia Peters. I'm happy to be with all of you today, and I can see, that many participants are being added in as we proceed with this topic that we have today. And it is a hard topic, and we all know that there are many social determinants to our health. And this is a really sensitive one, and something that a lot of us really don't like to talk about. And so I'm happy, you know, that we have the technology today that we can come together. And I can just vision all of you, you know, who are located in several different places, but together we come in spirit to be able to talk about something, you know, that is really going to help with the healing within all of our communities. And so I will proceed with this prayer to bring us together. CIHR Institute Advisory. Great Spirit, we love you for all things that you do for us. We appreciate everything that you provide for us. We appreciate our ability to be able to bring our hearts, minds, and spirits together today. It is so important for us to be able to say a prayer, to associate with the Creator, the higher power, so that we may be able to meet the challenges that we have in today's world. Creator, we are all meant to be together. We are meant to provide support to one another. We are here to care for one another. And so, Creator, we ask you to put your blessings upon each and every one that is joined here today, and also for all of the ones who provide support to the growing needs that we need to in order for us to become fully whole and well again. So with Creator, we ask you for all of this in Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you getting us going, Virginia, and taking the time to sort of start us off with an opening prayer. It's always a pleasure to have you here. I really want to acknowledge the unceded territories that we're on today, all of us across the province. The Council's main office is on Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam Nations. I'm here in Kamloops with Shupemnik lands that I'm on today. I want to take a moment now to hand it over to our presenter and welcome Charlotte Loafie. In many ways, Charlotte moved mountains to be able to join us here today. She's on her holidays and has been able to connect with us via cell phone so she could join us for this presentation. We're really thrilled to have Charlotte and have her share her wisdom and knowledge on this journey as we move forward. Charlotte comes with a wealth of experience and knowledge. She's a professor in the School of Public Health and Social Policy in the Faculty of Human and Social Development at the University of Victoria. She's a director of the Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement, which is a CIRCLE program, and she is also the editor of the International Journal of Indigenous Health. She joins us today to talk about, you know, some of the social determinants of health, and a really important topic. And Charlotte's history is to collaborate on Indigenous-focused initiatives aimed at research capacity development, mentorship, and training. She really looks at developing research relationships and undertaking research projects, and also sharing her knowledge with diverse communities. And that's one of the things she's doing today. And we're really, truly honored to have Charlotte join us. I had the pleasure of hearing Charlotte speak this winter, and it was truly one of the most amazing talks I've heard. So I'm just delighted to have Charlotte join us today, and it's with pleasure I'd like to hand over to you, Charlotte, and welcome, and thanks again for doing the honor of joining us. I'm just popping up your first slide for you.
Great. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you to the elder for the prayer and opening us up in a good way. It's great to be here. I'm sitting on the shores of Swan Lake, just outside of Vernon. Beautiful country, and yeah, I'm because I was not able to join via internet, I'm going to be asking Colleen or Sue to advance my slides. So the title is pretty straightforward. Racism as a social determinant of health for Indigenous peoples, and so I'm going to get started if we can advance the slide. If you have any problem advancing them, just let me know because I'll just advance mine at the same time. So I wanted to start off by honoring the Songhees and the Esquimalt and Wasanic peoples upon whose territory I live and work, and have been a very grateful visitor for about 8 years. My home is in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq territory. I get back there whenever I can. And so I also, if we could advance to the next slide, want to honor my family, my daughter and sisters and mother and grandparents and great-grandparents. We're all a product of those relationships, and I think it's important for us to honor their influence in our lives. So if we could advance to the next slide. I like to begin with this quote. I think, you know, you can see it's 35 years old. It's as relevant today as it's ever been, particularly in terms of the topic that we're going to be covering today, which is this notion of race, right? And so if we perceive reality in terms of the racial, in this case, categories we've learned to impose on that reality, that actively shapes us. It shapes us, it shapes how we see other people, and then in many ways we construct a reality that conforms to those images that we've already created. So it's important to think about that whenever we're talking about something like race and racism. So the next slide. Just a couple of definitions here about race and about racialization. It's important to note whenever we talk about racism that race is not, it's not a product of nature. There is no such thing as race. It's a social construct, which means people saw differences in what they call phenotypes, so things like skin color and hair texture and facial features, and they attached a label of race to those differences. Those differences are actually, there's more diversity within groups than there is, you know, between groups of what we would call racialized people. But the problem lies not so much in this notion of, you know, differences in physical characteristics, as it is that racial categories have also evolved to include things like cognitive behavior or intelligence, morals, and behavioral characteristics, which starts to become problematic, and I'll talk about that in a little while. So this concept of racialization is also important, because if we agree or we know that race is a social construction, not an actual biological thing, when we racialize, we assign a racial category to people or groups of people. And this can also include the internalization of racialization, right? So most of us who have internalized or have accepted this notion of race have also accepted a racial identity, right? So not only do we racialize other people, but we racialize ourselves. So in the next slide, I just wanted to start talking about racism, and I'm going to go into this in quite a bit of detail in the conversation, but racism really is about this notion that we take on a belief system and we develop attitudes and behaviors based on this, and it's erroneous, right? The belief is not factual, but we believe that race exists, right, and that it produces all of these differences between groups of people, right, and then we tend to often believe that our own racial group is superior to others. That's what racism is. So there's sort of there's two things going on here. First is there's hundreds of isms, you know, there's Marxism and Buddhism and sexism, right? So those are, they represent philosophical or political or moral beliefs about different things. And in this case, it is the belief that race exists, that it's a real thing, that we can tell things about people by their race, and that, like I said, in general, when we think about racism, it's this notion that those beliefs also have what we call a hierarchy, which means that people believe that some racialized groups are smarter, more moral, you know, the list goes on, right? But there's some difference, but it's not, you know, it's not benign. So in the next slide, this is a continuation of this definition. And so the first bullet really talks about what most people think of when they think about racism, right? That's, you know, fear and intolerance and hatred of people who've been racialized other than oneself. But the more difficult one to think about, the one that's actually entrenched in societies that makes it really difficult for people to change, is that policies and systems of governance can be racist in the sense that they are, first of all, based on this idea that race exists, but they also foster discrimination on the basis of race, right? So in the next slide, so this trajectory, you know, I've tried to, over the years, you know, think about how racism creates these inequalities, right? And so this is really just my attempt to do that. And so first of all, we have this, what we call an ideology of race. So we believe, most people, most societies, at least colonized societies, right? Because in some countries, you know, most people have the same sort of phenotype, so there hasn't been as much racism, although across the globe now we have this construct of race, right? And so first it starts with that the belief that race exists. The second square here is really about that notion of a hierarchy that I was talking about, right? And so there isn't, you know, race wasn't constructed on like a flat plane. There was a hierarchy created in those 1600s when European settlers and explorers and philosophers started to construct this concept of race. They basically had European people at the top, and then other people, usually people that were racialized as Asian next, and people that were racialized as, in those days it was Native Americans, now Indigenous people, and then people who were racialized as African or Black were at the bottom, right? That was the way it went. So, you know, if people are functioning based on that belief and then that racial hierarchy, right, it's not a surprise that they might have negative beliefs and attitudes, some stereotypes about, in this case, Indigenous people when they're interacting with them. Those negative beliefs and stereotypes lead people to discriminate against, because you can discriminate for someone as well. You can see someone who you know, think is great, and then you treat them better. You're discriminating. To discriminate is to treat things differently based on certain attributes, right? So these negative beliefs result in discrimination. Of course, the discrimination results in inequities, not inequalities, inequities, unfairness, right? So if we go to the next slide, me and my colleagues, a lot of folks around the world have been working on these social determinants of health, this business of trying to figure out why some people are healthier than other people. And so the determinants of health are those things usually in the social environment. And I think most of the people listening on the WebEx today know about these things. Over the past number of years, we've been looking at these determinants based on different kinds of models. The tree works best for me. it makes most sense to me. It represents, complex systems working together. It's part of the natural environment. Most people are pretty familiar with it, so it's not an uncommon model for people. And so if you think about those STEM determinants, or, those are determinants that have immediate effect on people's health, right? And so if we look at racism as a determinant of Indigenous people's health, when Indigenous people are interacting with other people on an individual basis, and individual racism is perpetrated, and I'll talk about what that looks like later, but most people have a sense of that, that can have an impact on someone's health on an immediate level, like physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, right? And so, that's where we usually end. That's where we usually maintain our focus, is on, racial, racism at that individual level. But what we've started to understand is that the core, or this sort of systemic level, where institutions of, could be education, employment, health, governance, right? Those institutions actually are shaping those immediate or individual environments in lots of cases, right? Particularly within those systems, which is, I know, where most of the folks on this call are coming from. But then the question becomes, how did those systems come to be fostering those kinds of behaviors? Or even if they're not fostering them, how did they come to occur in those? And so then we look at the root determinants, right? So those are the unseen structures in a society at the root, whether it's ideological, whether it's the way a society's been set up, its politics, its economy. Those are all the contexts that are shaping not just individual beliefs and behaviors, but also those systemic environments. So you can see how there's a multiple flows of influence up and down, right, through that structure. So it makes it very difficult to pinpoint an area where change has to occur, or where change is going to make the most profound impact. I would argue that it has to be at the root level. So on the next slide, I've for a long time been thinking about, how has the sort of structural racism shaped individual racism, particularly in Canada. So if you go to the right of this PowerPoint, under the political, on the political side, if you think historically, so number 4 on the individual side, on the left-hand side, we have discriminatory behaviors in personal, social, and work environments. So the question becomes, how does that happen, right? So if we go back over to number 1 on the political side, we have to start in the historical context, right, which is European settlers had a desire to colonize first Canada. They didn't call it Canada at the time, but this new world, right, this occupied world. The desire to colonize and then later oppress for the purposes of accessing the resources in this country, right? Now, in order to justify the colonization of Canada and colonial rule, right, those racist beliefs were used. Indigenous people were characterized as savages, as redskins, as subhumans, right? But definitely on a lower, level on that racial hierarchy. So that's a justification for doing that. But in order to sustain colonial rule, policies had to be put in place that made sure that Indigenous people basically didn't assert their rights to the country that they occupied, right? So in order to do that, in order for that colonial rule to be perpetuated, the government had to, and education and lots of other institutions had to perpetuate this notion of racism and racist beliefs, and also what I call a mystery. So it's a mis-history. It's a false history about Indigenous people, the contribution Indigenous people have made to the colonizers, the settlers and their success in even being able to survive here, and their contribution to Canadian society, right? So if we sit there for a minute and say, okay, so now we have a society where racist beliefs prevail and there is a lack of understanding about the history of colonization here, that's influencing people's basic knowledge about our shared history, right? And so because of that, and this is just one sort of potential line of trajectory because there's lots of others, but because most Canadians or non-Indigenous Canadians don't know about the history of Canada and the colonization of Canada, when they view the social or the health or economic disparities or inequalities that are being experienced by Indigenous people, and they wonder why that's happening, right? They assume that the reason it happens, these current conditions exist, is because of these racist beliefs, right? So this notion that Indigenous people, there's lots of stereotypes attached to Indigenous people and why the situation that lots of people live in now exists. And it doesn't have anything to do with colonization. The assumption is that it has everything to do with the individuals or the group as a racialized group, right? If people have that belief, they often then develop negative attitudes about Indigenous people and they discriminate against Indigenous people, right? So that's one way of looking at how the structure, like how structural racism is connected to this individual racism, right? So if we go to the next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about structural racism. People don't often hear this term much, but if you think about discrimination on a broader scale, societal level, things like slavery, genocide, the Holocaust, right? Those are overt expressions of racism, but racial discrimination isn't always expressed in those kind of overt ways, right? Sometimes, as I mentioned, those roots are sort of deep within the structures of a society, so much so that people don't often question or challenge the fact that, for instance, that most powerful people in Canada are almost exclusively racialized as white males from privileged backgrounds, or that the policies and the programs and the practices of our society almost always privilege members of those groups, right? And so those inequities, those unfair things are seen as neutral or natural, that this is just the way things are. So if we go to the next slide. So the issue then becomes, and I know for the purposes of this WebEx, is anti-Indigenous racism in healthcare. So it's important for us to not just talk about racism within healthcare, because racism can be directed at any racialized group, right? Racism can be directed at people who are, for all intents and purposes, racialized as white or Caucasian. It's just that the discrimination is going to typically move in a positive direction, right? So one of the things that I talk to my students about, and it's amazing how comfortable students are with changing the way they think sometimes. Because what I say is that if we all accept that we've bought into this false notion of race, that makes us all racist, right? And so it's not an insult you hurl at somebody who's being unkind. It's something that we all have, to some extent, taken on in our belief systems. So if we start the conversation by saying, yeah, we're all racist. So now let's talk about how we behave in discriminatory ways, right? Not whether or not we're racist, but just that we are. And now, how do we discriminate on the basis of that? And how do we try to move away from that, or at least challenge ourselves whenever those thoughts come up? So we're moving to the slide. I don't know if I already said that or not, but systemic and relational would be the slide after that. And so these are some examples of how at the systemic and relational level within healthcare, Indigenous people are experiencing racialized discrimination, right? And so this is well documented. None of these things are hearsay. This is not something I, heard the other day. These are well documented in studies, and so we know that people who have been racialized as Indigenous within healthcare systems often have longer wait times. For people with complex or ambiguous, let's say, health concerns like Brian Sinclair, often have substantial wait periods and are treated in ways that sometimes harms them and sometimes ends their life. So that's a pretty overt form, right? But there are other more subtle forms. And so we also know, and this is through research, that fewer Indigenous people are referred to specialists. We know that fewer Indigenous people are prescribed pain medication. We have massive evidence of folks who have reported disrespectful treatment that demeans them, diminishes them, and disempowers them because of their cultural identity. And that has a real impact on their well-being, not just in that sort of individual context where they're being treated poorly, but most people would tell you if they go into a place, no matter where it is, clothing store, supermarket, a car dealership, if they're treated disrespectfully, chances are really good that they're never going to go back to that place again. And this is often the case in healthcare systems and institutions and offices where Indigenous people are treated disrespectfully, often, and the response by some of them is to not return, right? So that has a huge impact on screening, testing, follow-up, and treatment, right? So the next slide, we're going to go back to this notion of structural racism a little bit. As I already mentioned, this can be historical, social, political institutions and processes that create or practice or reinforce systemic and relational racism. So some of the examples here, and these are just some examples, include the location and the conditions of Indigenous communities. And so again, remember this is structural, right? And so when the European settlers came and created a government of Canada, they created an Indian Act. That's a policy, it's legislation in Canada, and they determined areas, locations where what was now considered to be Crown land were going to be reserved for the use of, at the time, folks were called Indians, right? We know that those places are often, not always, but often in remote locations that are not very accessible to healthcare. That has been often, it's constructed in, urban areas or towns, and the conditions of the communities are often poor in terms of the infrastructure that was, again, provided by and is potentially supposed to be maintained by the federal government. So water, sewage, treatment, roads, all of those things. So that's the structural level. That's racism expressed at a structural level. I don't have to tell anybody about the horror of residential schools. That was a policy enforced from I think, the 1920s right up into the 1990s, that took children out of their homes and kept them in schools that were detrimental to their health. So people don't often talk about Indian hospitals, but those existed as well during the same period of time. People often that were diagnosed or not diagnosed but thought to be ill with things like tuberculosis were taken to those hospitals and left there for long periods of time. Other policies like the non-insured health benefits and some jurisdictional sand traps around political or federal and provincial health services for Indigenous people. And then research, which, you know, I'm a researcher. I've been doing this kind of research for about 20 years. And I can tell you that when I started and to this day, there is lots of research being done that is not benefiting or improving the health of Indigenous people. It is pathologizing Indigenous people in ways that get picked up as evidence. And then when people are engaging in evidence-based practice, this can become quite dangerous, right? So if we go to the next slide, these are just some questions that relate to other forms of racism that people often don't know about, they don't hear about. And so, you know, there's diverse forms of racism, but they don't occur in isolation from one another, right? So they're in fact interrelated. They create what we would call synergies of harm and disparity, right? And so these things permeate almost every element of people's lives and of the social systems in which we all interact, right? And so the first is what we call epistemic racism, right? And so this is the domination of Western or Euro-Canadian knowledge systems, so that Indigenous knowledge systems are not valued and they're not present in the institutions of education that we see, right? So along with the disregard and or the devaluing of Indigenous knowledge systems, we see the domination or the hegemony of Western systems. And this also means that resources are allocated to promoting and perpetuating Western knowledge systems. Sorry about the background noise. I believe it is a tractor. And so structural, I've missed one, no, I've got it here. So structural racism, we've talked about it a little bit, but, you know, this is really about isolating people from equal participation in and the contribution to economic and educational, political, and health systems and structures, right? But I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Colorblind, this is an interesting one because I hear this still to this day. So this form of racism is perpetuated by people who believe that because race is a social construct and we shouldn't even consider racial categories, right? And in theory, that's true. So, but it ignores the fact that racialization does exist and a racial hierarchy does perpetuate discrimination and inequality. So while we could agree that race is a social construction, we still have to address racism, which is a social reality, right? Relational racism, again, this is the kind of racism that most people talk about, but this isn't just about verbal abuse or violence, right? It also includes well-meaning but insulting remarks like, you know, you speak very well, or your people must be very proud of you, or those kinds of remarks that maybe within a context of folks who see themselves as belonging to the same racialized group without power imbalances might seem like benign comments. And lots of those folks don't understand why they're disrespectful because they've never lived as a person who's racialized in a minority position, right? Other ways of relational racism is avoiding contact with Indigenous people, not having Indigenous friends, not necessarily, promoting relationships at work with Indigenous people, being reluctant to engage in conversations just in a social setting with Indigenous people. And the last I would say is, when people hear about racism or people's experience of racism, they prefer to ignore it. They prefer to silence it. They don't really, or minimize it. They don't really want to talk about it. And that's a form of racism because it stops the conversation, right? So the last one is really, it's really this notion of embodied racism. And so it's important to remember that the effects of racism are experienced in the body, right? Because it involves the well-being of a person, right? So all racialized people experience the effect, but for those who are relegated to the lower sort of levels of the racial hierarchy, the effect is detrimental, right? And so the research is very clear that racism in all of its form does harm to the individual, and it creates environments that are equally harmful to human health, right? So if we go to the next slide, this is really the point where, I would like people to think about, about themselves, about the systems that they work in, about the structures of our collective society and where change can happen, right? And so, the first is cultural safety or anti-racist training. And I think we need to call it that sometimes to be clear about what we're talking about and why we're talking about, like why cultural safety as a concept even exists, right? Cultural safety exists because cultural risk exists. And cultural risk exists because racism exists, right? And so if we can encourage health professionals to consider how their racial identity and their social position, because that social position is often racialized, right? It's created out of a racialized identity. How has that shaped their practice, right? And so folks who've never thought about that are often the people that need this kind of training the most, right? And then if we move beyond that, we can talk about then, and those are these things take years, right? But attempting then to reshape the system, right? And in one way is really just to increase the representation of Indigenous people in those systems, working in those systems, but also as, in an advisory capacity in those systems, or having those systems really focus on research that's been conducted by, for, and with Indigenous people so that community-based voices and are driving and informing the care that people are getting, right? The other, at a larger level, we really need to think about how are we governing social interactions, right? And so how are we creating anti-discriminatory, or if you like the word reconciliation, some people do, some people don't, policies, right? And so how are we creating systems such as justice and employment and obviously health that are not just trying to improve health through sort of traditional ways, but are actually trying to reduce relational and structural racism. So the First Nations Health Authority is a perfect example of that, right? This is occurring at a structural level where Indigenous leadership has been taken on as part of the health governing in British Columbia, right? And so that's a high level. That's important, but from my perspective, it's important to look at all of those strata, if you will, of influence, right? From the individuals at the cultural safety sort of racist training, and right to the political and the social. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to say thank you for listening. I hope it has been helpful, and I'm very happy to take questions from participants.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I'm going to invite everyone to pop any questions you may have in the chat box. You know, Charlotte, really appreciate you joining us today. And one thing that really resonated from your conversation, well, there's many things, but, you know, the need to examine how we behave, not if, but how we behave in discriminatory ways, and then take action to move away from this behavior. So that's just a concrete example of, you know, the reality is it's there, so what can we do to change it? And I think, you know, looking at addressing the issue and some of the suggestions you had around addressing the issue, from cultural safety and anti-racism training to increased Indigenous representation, community-based and driven care. So we'd love to hear from folks on the call what actions they could take, you know, hearing some of these brilliant ideas around calls to action for starting to shift things. It's a great question that's just come into the chat box now as others start filing in, but the question was, can you give an example of evidence-based practice that you see in our health authorities around policies, et cetera, on this topic? I'm going to just read that again to you, Charlotte, because I know you can't see the question, but can you give an example of evidence-based practice that you are seeing in our health authorities, policies, et cetera?
So I guess when you're talking about our health authorities, you're just talking about generally BC health authorities? So
yeah, we'll just say that for now. This is coming from Kamala Olson. So Kamala, if you want to clarify in the chat box, we're happy to do that and open up your line if you prefer. We can always unmute you.
So
let's assume yes for now, Charlotte, until we hear otherwise.
Let's just start. Well, the reason I say that is because there are, you know, several health authorities in British Columbia, and for each one there's slightly different practice. And I'm just thinking that, you know, for the First Nations Health Authority, you know, the evidence-based practice might be quite different than it is for another health authority. One of the potential difficulties that I've seen just in some of the research that I'm aware of is this notion of, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but I'm saying there's potential problems, is that when health authorities create their health plans, their strategic plans, oftentimes, well, in some cases, Indigenous people or the specific contexts and needs of Indigenous people are not recognized within those plans. And when they are, it's done in a separate plan, so that the strategic plan doesn't necessarily engage with that in that sort of discussion. It refers to the Aboriginal plan. And sometimes that Aboriginal plan isn't the focus of determining practice. So that is a potential problem when it comes to practice, right? Because those specific, I mean, ideally, those plans are based on, you know, research, what we know, right? Hopefully that helps.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So one of the questions that's come up as well here, Charlotte, in the chat box is just a question around integrating the Indigenous voice. So, you know, one of the solutions that you recommended, so this comes from Colleen McGavin, and she said one of the solutions is increasing Indigenous representation. And she's inquiring about what your advice is about how to integrate the Indigenous voice within a group that is largely white and middle class.
Yeah, well, if there is no, if Indigenous people are not represented in the actual, like the literal space, the environment, right? And even if there are Indigenous people, employed there, we wouldn't want those folks to be singled out as the person who is, you know, responsible for, you know, the Indigenous voice. It means, again, if you think about, for me, the tree is really helpful. model to use, because if we think about the environments in which we're working, we're interacting with people, and that's in those STEM environments, right? So at that superficial level, when we're interacting with people. And so if you're in a situation where there are no Indigenous service providers, but there are Indigenous clients, and so that environment has to be informed by, ideally, you would want some sort of systemic policies or programs in place, right? So you wouldn't want to have, even if you have 5 people, let's say, and they're all, aware of racism and their own, potentially racist beliefs. They've taken the training, they've become culturally safe in their behavior, and then they all, for one reason or another, leave, or 4 of them leave, right? That means that the system hasn't created an environment that is conducive to cultural safety. It's been left up to the individual, right? So the system is responsible. So first of all, individuals are responsible first for their own cultural and racial awareness, right? Aware that racism exists, aware that they have been socialized within this racial construct, and that they are likely have racist beliefs and behaviors, because everybody does. Let's just say that. But the system in which they work is also accountable for understanding the local Indigenous contexts, the research that's been conducted, right? So that their programs, their services, their policies are also culturally safe and culturally appropriate, right? So that's Indigenous representation. It means getting to know local communities, getting to know the elders, getting to know the knowledge keepers, getting to know the people who are providing services or accessing services, engaging in those people in respectful relationships that take a long time, and they take effort on the part of, well, everybody, really. But that can happen, right? That's representation as well. Hopefully.
Wonderful. And I think that's incredible food for thought in terms of action as well, Charlotte. There's so many questions coming in the chat box. I'm just going to apologize to everyone now. I'm not sure we're going to get through them all, but I'm going to try and do them justice. 2 related questions that came in, so I'm going to bring them together simultaneously for you, Charlotte. And one of the ones is from Madeline, and she asks, when we encounter racism in the system as a consumer, what is the best way to bring it up with our healthcare provider? And a question from an ally to add to that would be, as a community provider, what is the best way to encourage people who ID as Indigenous to advocate for themselves when experiencing racism, and how can we support them? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on those 2 questions.
Right. I'm just trying to think of how they're combined. But what I would say is, it's extremely difficult. And I'm not saying it's extremely difficult for everyone, because some people feel very comfortable with confrontation. When they're treated disrespectfully, they feel comfortable and confident in confronting the person or the system. But again, it's important to remember that when you have an entire structure of society that is feeding into these systems and these behaviors, it's very hard to really make change. And people often put themselves at more risk, sometimes socially, economically, and so forth, if they confront racism. So like I said, I don't say to people, if they feel comfortable confronting it, then I think it's important to do that. But I also believe that non-Indigenous people who are in a position of racialized power, it really is their responsibility to be an ally and to confront racism. And not everyone, because not everyone can and not everyone just feels comfortable doing it. But it's very different when a person who is racialized as white confronts another person who's racialized as white. for racist behavior. It's never pretty, usually. People are not comfortable with being criticized ever, and no one wants to think of themselves as being racist. But it's easier. It's not good, but it's easier. And I think it really requires collective action. Single incidents, yes, it's important to stand up and say in the workplace, if you're a non-Indigenous person and you hear about or hear directly or see racist conduct, I think it's critical that you address it. But I think collectively there has to be, we have seatbelts, we have, anti-child abuse laws, regulations. We have, as a society, thought about ways to govern irresponsible or unsafe behavior. And I think the critical element of addressing racism is understanding it as for what it is and taking collective action to think about specific ways that at an individual, a systemic, and also a structural level, we go about creating safety for people. And sometimes it's by encouraging people, and sometimes it's by regulating people. Sometimes you just have to play, the stick rather than the carrot.
I think that's a really good point. Oh, sorry. No, I think it's important, and what you raised, Charlotte, is the critical element. What I heard you say of addressing racism is understanding what it is, and then that collective action coming together. And I heard you kind of talk about the role of allies and what allies can play in that work. And I think that's really important in terms of that additional support or role for people on the calls, because there's lots of questions coming up in the chat box around that. Yeah.
Well, and I guess
oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to say that, it's really important for non-Indigenous people to understand that racism doesn't just create inequalities for Indigenous people. It actually creates advantage for non-Indigenous people, right? And so I think when people can understand that their own racialized identity can actually benefit their lives in unfair ways. For some people, that's huge motivation. For other people, they say, well, that's great for me and too bad for other people. But for some people, it's not something they've thought about before, and so I think it's a really important thing for people to realize that they are that they live in a society that actually benefits them because they just happen to be racialized as white. And so what is their responsibility to balance that? And so that they are not, and the hardest thing for people to give up is their own benefit, right? People don't want to give up something that's actually good for them. It's one thing to say, let's reduce the harm, but then to say, okay, in reducing the harm, you're actually going to have to give something up, or you're going to have to put yourself, you're going to have to put yourself in some jeopardy when you confront racism. Like, that's a tougher sell.
I think a really important point is that advantage it does create, though, Charlotte. So thank you for highlighting that. And we have a million other questions in the chat box, and I'm just noticing that we only have a minute to go, so we're not going to be able to touch on all of them. So I apologize to you whose questions we haven't been able to get to. Is there any sort of final comments you'd like to say before we wrap up today, Charlotte?
Well, what I want to say to you, to all the folks at the BC Patient Safety, and to everyone on the call, thank you. And to Virginia, I'm so grateful that all of you were willing to listen to me speak about this. I don't know anything. These are just my thoughts and what I've learned from other people, many other people who've done amazing work before me. But thank you. Thank you for listening. Hopefully, thank you for starting a conversation about this in your workplaces and in your homes and wherever. And I think that if we all work together, this is a problem that was, it was created socially, and it won't be solved unless we all work together.
Thank you so much, and I think those are really amazing words to leave us with today, Charlotte, in terms of each of us has that ability and accountability for taking action and seeing a shift happen. I can't thank you enough for your time today, Charlotte. You're on your holidays. You've bent over backwards to make this work, and it's always such a pleasure to hear you speak, and some real amazing food for thought as we work in this system. And I know all of us on the call today are really joining together to see what we can do to start seeing a shift, to start accelerating change in the system. And when we look at some of these systemic issues, it really helps us reflect on that. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts for joining us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
It's truly wonderful. Wanted to just sort of move forward now and share about our subsequent session on August 2nd. We will have some personal stories of experience with the health system on August 2nd from 12 until 1. So for those of you who want to join us for one more session this summer, we're really looking forward to that, from hearing more people who receive care in the system and what their stories and experiences have been and how we can learn from those. We want to remind you that there is a survey. We really do encourage you to take the time to complete the survey. It'll pop up when you finish today's webinar. We just ask that you take the time. We look at every one of those surveys and we really reflect on them to make sure we're hearing your voice. We're hearing what people want to have on the phone in terms of continuing to accelerate the work of transformation in this area. Last but not least, I want to just invite Virginia to close our call today and as we wrap up today's time together. Virginia, I hand it to you. Great, we can hear you now.
Okay. I want to say, Kwasai, thank you. Thank you, CIHR, for bringing us all together today, for something, that is very sensitive to us, something that we really don't want to talk about all the time. And I just really want to thank the Creator for allowing us to come together today, to thank Charlotte, and to thank you, Colleen, for bringing us all together. We certainly learned a lot more today, and I'm sure we're all going to be able to use those in the communities and places where we do provide services. So with that, we say thank you, Creator, OCM.
OCM, and thank you so much for joining us again. So I want to just reiterate my thanks to both Virginia and Charlotte for joining us today. It's just a pleasure to have you both with us. And in the background behind every one of these events is Sue Bradley. Sue's also known as BCPS QC host, for those of you who don't know, and she works really tirelessly to have these sessions come together as well. So just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to join us, and particular thanks to Virginia and Charlotte today. As we move forward. So we look forward to seeing you in August. A reminder that we will be posting these slides and the recording from today's session. You can watch for them. You should receive an email by tomorrow, if not soon after that. Thank you, everyone.